The African landscape is defined by cycles of growth and decay, of life emerging from death and death making way for new life, patterns that repeat endlessly across the continent's diverse ecosystems and that create the fundamental conditions within which all wildlife must survive. Trees, those ancient pillars of the ecosystem that provide shade, shelter, food, and structure to countless species, follow their own cycles, growing from seeds to mighty giants over decades or centuries, then eventually succumbing to drought, disease, lightning strikes, or simply the accumulated weight of years, becoming standing dead monuments to their former glory before finally collapsing to the earth, where their decomposing wood feeds new generations of plants and animals. These dead trees, known to ecologists as snags, are far from lifeless despite their appearance. They serve as critical habitat for countless species, including birds that excavate nesting cavities in the softening wood, insects that consume and break down the dead tissue, and mammals that use the hollow trunks and branches as shelter from predators and weather. But in all the extensive scientific literature on snag ecology and on the myriad ways that wildlife utilizes dead trees, there are few, if any, documented cases of lions showing particular interest in these structures, let alone refusing to leave them despite circumstances that should have driven them to move on in search of food, water, or more suitable shelter. Lions are not tree-dwelling creatures like leopards who regularly haul kills into branches or rest in elevated positions that provide cooling breezes and protection from ground-dwelling scavengers. Lions are terrestrial predators who conduct virtually all their activities on the ground, who rest in shade when they can find it, but who show no particular affinity for trees living or dead. This fundamental understanding of lion behavior made the events that unfolded in Botswana's Moremi Game Reserve in March 2021 all the more remarkable and puzzling, an incident that would challenge assumptions, reveal unexpected dimensions of maternal behavior in lions, and ultimately demonstrate that animals continue to surprise us when we pay attention to the details of individual behavior rather than relying solely on generalized species descriptions. The story begins with a routine patrol by anti-poaching rangers working for a private wildlife conservation organization that operated in the Moremi region in partnership with Botswana's Department of Wildlife and National Parks. The patrol team, consisting of 4 rangers led by a veteran field operator named Ketumetse Moremi, was conducting its regular circuit through a section of the reserve that bordered areas used by several lion prides whose territories overlapped in this resource-rich region characterized by permanent water, abundant prey populations including impala, kudu, and buffalo, and diverse habitat types ranging from mopane woodland to open grassland and seasonal floodplains that filled during the annual inundation that transformed much of the Okavango Delta ecosystem. The patrol, which typically took 3 to 4 days to complete, depending on conditions and on what the team encountered along their route, was primarily focused on looking for signs of illegal hunting activity, checking for wire snares set by poachers, documenting fresh tracks or other evidence of human intrusion into protected areas, and generally maintaining a visible presence that deterred poaching and demonstrated that the wildlife within the reserve was being actively monitored and protected. But the rangers also served important wildlife monitoring functions, recording sightings of key species, noting conditions at water sources, observing any animals that appeared injured or in distress, and generally keeping watch over the ecosystem in ways that complemented the scientific research conducted by dedicated wildlife biologists. It was during this patrol, on the second day when the team was traveling through an area of mixed woodland and grassland several kilometers from the nearest permanent water source, that Ketumetse noticed something unusual that made him signal for the patrol vehicle to stop. Approximately 100 meters off the track, clearly visible in the relatively open terrain, was a large dead tree, a mopane that had probably died several years earlier based on the extent of bark loss and branch fall, standing as a gray skeleton against the green-brown landscape. Dead trees were common enough in this environment, but what caught Ketumetse's attention and what seemed worthy of investigation was the presence of a lioness at the base of this particular tree, lying in a position that suggested she was not simply resting in whatever minimal shade the dead branches might provide, but was deliberately stationed there, focused on the tree itself, rather than on her surroundings in the alert, aware manner that characterized lions even when resting. Using his binoculars, Ketumetse observed the lioness more carefully, noting details that increased his concern and curiosity about what he was seeing. The lioness appeared to be in poor physical condition, her ribcage visible, suggesting malnutrition or at least several days without a successful kill, her coat dull and dusty, and her posture conveying something that Ketumetse's years of experience reading animal body language interpreted as distress or anxiety, rather than the relaxed contentment of a well-fed lion at rest. Even more concerning and puzzling, the lioness was not alone at the tree. Circling at a distance of perhaps 20 to 30 meters were 3 hyenas, members of the spotted hyena species that were both successful hunters in their own right and opportunistic scavengers who excelled at stealing kills from other predators or at detecting and exploiting any sign of weakness or vulnerability in other animals. The presence of hyenas circling a solitary lioness was itself unusual and suggested that the hyenas sensed opportunity, perhaps detecting that the lioness was weakened and vulnerable, or perhaps knowing that she was guarding something, a kill or cubs, that they might be able to access if they could drive her away or distract her attention. But the most puzzling aspect of the scene was that the lioness showed no signs of leaving despite the harassment from the hyenas, and despite what must have been the pressing need to find food and water given her obvious poor condition. She remained positioned at the base of the dead tree, occasionally standing and making aggressive displays toward the hyenas when they approached too closely, but always returning to the same spot, her attention repeatedly directed not outward toward the threats around her, but upward and inward, toward the tree itself in a pattern that made no sense to Ketumetse based on everything he knew about lion behavior. Ketumetse made the decision to investigate more closely, both because a lioness in such obviously poor condition might need intervention if she was injured or sick, and because the unusual behavior warranted documentation and possible reporting to wildlife veterinarians or researchers who might want to study whatever was causing this atypical situation. He directed the driver to approach slowly, watching the lioness's reaction carefully, and prepared to stop or retreat if she showed signs of viewing the vehicle as a threat or if her behavior escalated toward aggression. The hyenas, seeing the vehicle approach, withdrew to a greater distance, but did not leave entirely, continuing to circle and watch from perhaps 50 meters away, their persistence suggesting they were invested in whatever opportunity this situation represented, and were waiting for chances to exploit it. As the patrol vehicle drew closer to the dead tree, to within perhaps 30 meters, which was close enough for detailed observation but far enough to maintain safety margins, Ketumetse and his team could see the lioness more clearly and could observe details that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The dead tree, now visible in greater detail, showed signs of significant decay with much of its bark missing, several major branches that had already fallen, leaving jagged stubs, and a large hollow visible in the trunk approximately 3 meters above ground level where a major branch had broken away and where the heartwood had rotted out, creating a cavity that extended into the main trunk. The lioness's attention was focused primarily on this hollow, and she would periodically stand on her hind legs, reaching up toward the cavity with her front paws in a manner that looked almost like she was trying to climb up to it or trying to reach something inside it. Though lions are not natural climbers, and her attempts to gain height against the trunk were clumsy and unsuccessful. Ketumetse watched this behavior repeat several times, the lioness rising up against the trunk, stretching toward the hollow, then dropping back down and pacing anxiously around the base of the tree before repeating the sequence. The pattern was so clearly purposeful and so obviously directed at the hollow in the tree that Ketumetse began to suspect that something was inside that cavity, something that the lioness was desperately trying to reach but couldn't access due to the height and her inability to climb effectively. The most logical explanation, given the lioness's apparent maternal anxiety and her refusal to abandon this position despite hunger, thirst, and harassment from hyenas, was that her cubs were somehow inside that hollow, trapped in a situation where they couldn't or wouldn't come down and where she couldn't reach them to help. But this explanation, while it fit the observable behavior, created its own set of puzzling questions. How would lion cubs, which at young ages had limited climbing ability themselves, have gotten into a hollow 3 meters above ground? Had they perhaps been carried there by the mother herself when they were very young, placed in the hollow as a den site that she had thought would provide safety from ground predators? Had they climbed up on their own, perhaps fleeing from hyenas or other threats and managing to scramble up the trunk in their panic before becoming trapped in the hollow, unable to figure out how to descend? Or was there some other explanation that Ketumetse wasn't considering, some scenario he hadn't imagined that would make sense of this unusual situation? Ketumetse decided that the only way to answer these questions and to determine what intervention, if any, might be appropriate was to investigate the hollow directly. This meant approaching on foot to a position where he could see into the cavity, or could use a tool like a stick to probe inside and determine what was there. A course of action that carried obvious risks, given the presence of a stressed lioness who might react defensively if she perceived him as a threat to whatever she was protecting. He discussed the situation with his team, explaining what he intended to do and ensuring that the other rangers understood their roles in maintaining watch, in being prepared to intervene if the lioness charged, and in documenting whatever was discovered. Ketumetse exited the vehicle slowly, speaking in a calm, low voice in the direction of the lioness, trying to communicate through tone and body language that he meant no threat and was there to help rather than to harm. The lioness, exhausted and anxious, watched his approach with obvious tension, but did not immediately flee or attack. Instead, she backed away slightly from the tree, creating space but maintaining her position nearby in a manner that suggested she was willing to tolerate his presence as long as he didn't harm whatever was in the hollow that she was protecting so fiercely. Ketumetse approached the tree cautiously, keeping the lioness in his peripheral vision while focusing primarily on the hollow that was now at roughly his head height as he stood at the base of the trunk. As he drew close enough to peer into the cavity, as his eyes adjusted to the darkness inside the hollow and he began to make out shapes and details within, Ketumetse heard a sound that made his heart leap and that instantly clarified the entire situation. From inside the hollow came the unmistakable mewing cries of lion cubs, the high-pitched vocalizations that young lions make when distressed or when calling for their mother, sounds that were both plaintive and demanding, communicating need and vulnerability in equal measure. Ketumetse carefully positioned himself to see into the hollow more clearly, and what he saw explained everything and created an urgent need for intervention that would require care, expertise, and a bit of luck to execute successfully. Inside the hollow, huddled together in the confined space, were 2 lion cubs, probably around 8 to 10 weeks old based on their size, looking up toward the opening with eyes that reflected the light and with expressions that even across species boundaries communicated fear and desperation. The cubs were alive but clearly in distress, having been trapped in this hollow for what must have been at least a day or possibly longer based on the mother's condition and the urgency of the situation. They appeared too weak or too frightened to attempt to climb or jump down from the hollow, the drop of 3 meters being significant enough that jumping could result in injury, and their mother, despite her desperate attempts, couldn't reach high enough to grab them or to provide them with a route down. How the cubs had gotten into the hollow in the first place became clearer as Ketumetse examined the tree more carefully. There were claw marks on the trunk, both old and fresh, suggesting that the lioness had been using this hollow as a den site, probably carrying the cubs up to it when they were younger and smaller by climbing partway up the angled trunk and depositing them in what she had judged to be a safe, elevated location protected from ground predators. This behavior, while unusual for lions who typically den in caves, dense vegetation, or rocky outcrops rather than in elevated tree hollows, was not completely unprecedented. Individual lions had been documented occasionally using atypical den sites when standard options weren't available or when previous experiences had taught them that certain locations provided better protection for vulnerable cubs. But the cubs had grown since they had first been placed in this den, and what had once been a safe refuge had become a trap. They were now too large and too heavy for their mother to carry down, and the drop was too far for them to jump safely on their own, leaving them stranded in a situation that would eventually lead to death from dehydration, starvation, or exposure if they weren't rescued. The mother's presence and her refusal to leave, despite her own desperate need for food and water, testified to the power of maternal bonds in lions and to the lengths that lionesses would go to protect their offspring even when the situation seemed hopeless. Keitumetse immediately radioed back to his base, explaining the situation and requesting assistance that would allow for a safe rescue of the trapped cubs. The response was swift and comprehensive. Within 2 hours, a team arrived that included a wildlife veterinarian, additional rangers with safety equipment, including a portable ladder that could be positioned against the tree to provide access to the hollow, and soft carriers that could be used to safely transport the cubs once they were retrieved. The veterinarian, Dr. Neo Kokosana, assessed the situation and developed a plan for the rescue that would minimize stress and risk to both the cubs and their mother. The first step was to tranquilize the lioness to prevent her from interfering with the rescue attempt or from becoming dangerously agitated as strange humans climbed up to her cubs and removed them from the den. Dr. Kokosana carefully calculated the appropriate dose based on the lioness's estimated weight, adjusted for her poor body condition, loaded the dart into a specialized rifle, and administered the tranquilizer from a safe distance. The lioness, already weakened by days without food, responded quickly to the sedation, her aggressive vigilance fading as the drugs took effect, and she gradually sank into unconsciousness, her body finally able to rest after what had clearly been an extended ordeal of stress and exhaustion. With the mother safely sedated, the rescue team positioned their ladder against the tree trunk, securing it carefully to ensure stability and safety for whoever would climb up to retrieve the cubs. Keitumetse volunteered for this task, climbing carefully up the ladder while speaking softly to the cubs who were now visible, peering out from the hollow, their large eyes watching his approach with a mixture of fear and what might have been hope, or at least recognition, that something was changing in their desperate situation. When he reached the level of the hollow, when he could reach inside and feel the warm, soft fur of the trapped cubs, Keitumetse experienced a moment of profound connection and purpose, understanding that this moment, this rescue, was exactly why he had chosen to dedicate his life to wildlife conservation. He carefully extracted the first cub, a male, from the hollow, holding the squirming, mewing youngster against his chest as he descended the ladder one careful step at a time, knowing that a fall could injure or kill the cub he was trying to save. He handed the first cub to Dr. Kosana, who quickly examined it, checking for injuries, dehydration, and overall condition before placing it in one of the soft carriers. Then Keitumetse climbed back up and retrieved the second cub, a female who was slightly smaller than her brother and who seemed more severely affected by the ordeal, her movements weaker and her cries more plaintive. Dr. Kagosana's examination of the female cub revealed more concerning signs, including significant dehydration and early hypothermia despite the warm daytime temperatures, conditions that indicated she had been in the hollow longer or had less body reserves to draw upon during the entrapment. Both cubs received immediate medical treatment, including subcutaneous fluids to address dehydration, glucose supplements to provide energy to bodies that had been without food for an extended period, and warming through the use of blankets and proximity to the rescuer's body heat. While the cubs were being treated and stabilized, Dr. Kosana also attended to their mother, taking advantage of her sedated state to provide medical care that would help her recover from the ordeal she had endured. He administered intravenous fluids to address her dehydration, gave her vitamin and mineral supplements to help combat the nutritional deficits created by days without eating, and conducted a thorough physical examination to check for any injuries or health problems beyond simple starvation and stress. The examination revealed that the lioness, while certainly in poor condition, had no serious injuries or illnesses and would recover fully once she was able to resume normal hunting and feeding. Her poor condition was entirely attributable to her refusal to leave her cubs to hunt, a sacrifice that testified to the strength of maternal instinct, but that would have eventually killed her if the situation had continued much longer. With both the cubs and their mother stabilized and treated, the rescue team faced the crucial question of what to do next. The standard protocol in such situations would typically be to transport the cubs to a rehabilitation facility where they could receive continued care until they were strong enough for release. But separation from their mother carried risks including potential rejection when they were eventually reunited and disruption of the maternal bond that was critical to their development and survival. Dr. Kgosana made the decision to keep the family together to allow the mother to recover from sedation in the presence of her cubs so that she could immediately resume maternal care and so that the cubs would never be separated from her familiar scent and presence. The team created a temporary sheltered area near the base of the tree, using the patrol vehicle to provide shade and using blankets to create a soft, protected space where the lioness could rest with her cubs as she emerged from tranquilization. The cubs, now warmed and hydrated and showing improved energy levels, were placed in this sheltered area, and the team retreated to a distance where they could observe without interfering as the lioness gradually regained consciousness. The reunion, as the lioness's awareness returned and she realized her cubs were beside her, safe and accessible, was captured on video by the rescue team and would later be shared widely on social media, where it touched millions of viewers who were moved by this demonstration of maternal devotion and by the successful outcome that had rescued a family from what seemed like certain tragedy. The lioness, still weak and unsteady from the tranquilizer, immediately began examining her cubs, sniffing them thoroughly, licking them, and making the low, rumbling vocalizations that lionesses use to communicate reassurance and recognition to their offspring. The cubs responded by pressing close to her, nursing eagerly from their mother, whose milk production had probably diminished during the days of stress and starvation, but which would recover as she was able to feed and regain condition. The rescue team maintained observation for several hours, ensuring that the lioness was recovering normally from the sedation and that the family unit was intact and functioning. They also provided a gift that would help jumpstart the lioness's recovery, a substantial amount of meat from a recent research culling operation that had been conducted in another part of the reserve for population management purposes. This meat, placed at a respectful distance from where the lioness rested with her cubs, would provide immediate nutrition without requiring her to hunt in her weakened state, giving her body the resources it needed to recover and to resume milk production that would sustain her cubs. As evening approached and the rescue team prepared to depart, they witnessed the lioness stand, test her strength, and then lead her cubs away from the cursed tree that had nearly killed them all, moving toward denser vegetation where she could establish a new, safer den site on the ground where the terrible trap of the elevated hollow could never again separate her from her cubs. The family disappeared into the bush, and the rescue team drove away knowing they had made a difference, had saved 3 lives that would otherwise have been lost, and had documented a remarkable case of maternal devotion that would contribute to scientific understanding of lion behavior and would inspire conservation messaging about the value of individual animals and the importance of intervention when humans could help. The story of the lioness who refused to leave the dead tree was shared widely in conservation circles and in mainstream media, becoming one of those rare wildlife rescue stories that captured public imagination and generated both emotional response and thoughtful discussion about human-wildlife relationships. The video footage showing Kay Tumetse climbing the ladder to retrieve the trapped cubs, the images of the exhausted lioness finally relaxing as she was reunited with her rescued offspring, and the narrative of a mother's refusal to abandon her children even at the cost of her own life resonated deeply with audiences around the world who saw in this story universal themes of parental love, sacrifice, and the triumph of compassion over indifference. For Kay Tumetse and his patrol team, the rescue became a career-defining moment, a validation of their choice to investigate unusual situations rather than simply noting them and moving on, a demonstration that attention to detail and willingness to intervene could save lives that might otherwise be lost. The incident reinforced the importance of patrol operations that went beyond just anti-poaching to include broader wildlife welfare monitoring and response capabilities. For Dr. Kagosana, the case provided valuable insights into maternal behavior in lions and into the sometimes unexpected situations that could create wildlife emergencies requiring veterinary intervention. The broader conservation community used the story to illustrate several important principles, including the value of individual animals in conservation, the importance of having trained responders who could handle wildlife emergencies, and the positive outcomes that were possible when humans chose to help rather than to simply observe or to intervene in ways that prioritized human convenience over animal welfare. The story also sparked discussions about the flexibility of lion denning behavior and about how environmental pressures, including predation risk from hyenas and other threats, might drive individual lions to adopt unusual strategies, including the use of elevated tree hollows that provided security but created new challenges. The cubs, whose lives had been saved by careful attention and quick response to their mother's distress, went on to survive to independence, eventually dispersing from their mother following normal lion developmental patterns. Their mother continued to inhabit the same general territory, though she never again attempted to use elevated tree hollows as den sites, apparently having learned through her nearly fatal experience that ground-level dens, while they had their own risks, were safer and more manageable than elevated locations that could trap growing cubs. The dead tree itself, the scene of both crisis and rescue, remained standing in the Moremi Game Reserve, a landmark that patrol teams would occasionally pass and remember the day when their attention to an unusual sight had led to saving a family. The question posed at the beginning of this story, why this lioness refused to leave the dead tree even when circumstances should have driven her away, has been answered through careful observation and brave intervention. She stayed because her cubs were trapped in the hollow, because maternal instinct would not allow her to abandon them, even to save her own life, because the bond between mother and offspring was stronger than hunger, thirst, fear, or self-preservation. The sound that rescuers heard when they finally investigated was the mewing of trapped cubs crying for help and for their mother, sounds that had been inaudible from distance, but that became impossible to ignore once humans drew close enough to hear and to understand. Under the seemingly senseless vigil of an emaciated lioness at a dead tree was a story of maternal devotion, of cubs in desperate need, and ultimately of humans choosing to respond with compassion and expertise, creating an outcome where tragedy was transformed into triumph, and where 3 lives that seemed lost were instead saved to continue their place in the great cycles of the African wilderness.